So anyways, I got cut off in the last video, and I just want to kind of pick up where I left off in that last video, and I want to just give you kind of the big picture. I want to jump right to this distinction that Kant is making. Kant makes a distinction in today's reading between two different kinds of judgments. By judgment, Kant simply means subsuming a bunch of particular things under a universal thing. That's what a judgment is. Judgment is making a general universal claim about a bunch of particular cases. That's all a judgment is. It has no connotation of, we use judgment in our everyday vernacular in a bunch of different ways, but judgment simply refers to, has an epistemological meaning here. Judgment has no other connotations for Kant. Anyways, I just wanted to look real quick at a few other things that Kant says on pages 680 and so he's on pages 680 and 681, right? So Kant is basically giving you here, this is Kant's project, and if you want like a succinct statement of Kant's project, then I really encourage you to look at the second column on page 6. So I'm looking at page 680 here. Second column on page 680. You really get a succinct statement of Kant's philosophy there. He says at the bottom, therefore, we shall therefore be concerned here only with experience, along with the universal conditions of its possibility that are given a priori and determine nature as the whole object of all possible experience. I think it will be understood here that I do not mean the observation of nature that is already given, for these already presuppose experience. I do not mean how we can study the laws of nature, or how we can study them, for in that case they would not be a priori laws and would not yield us a pure natural science, but rather how the a priori conditions of the possibility of experience are at the same time the sources from which all universal laws of nature must be derived. So that's one of the most succinct statements of Kant's philosophy as you can get. How the a priori conditions of the possibility of experience. So we've already got part of the a priori conditions of the possibility of experience are space and time. That is part of the a priori conditions of the possibility of experience. And then the second part of that is saying it's from Kant's critical philosophy, which gives us the a priori conditions of the possibility of experience. That's Kant's critical philosophy. It will give us those, and it's from those that we can derive what Kant is calling, or what natural science calls universal laws. It's from those conditions, space, time, and the pure concepts of the understanding. It's from those that we derive not only how we can understand things like mathematics and the laws of mathematics, but how we can also understand specific laws of natural science. In particular, if you go back over to page 680, Kant is talking about how we are talking about universal laws. In particular, every event is determined by a cause according to constant laws. So that is a natural law of natural science. And Kant is going to say that's what Hume has denied. Hume has denied that every event is determined by a cause, that is some kind of law. Hume has said the most that we can have about saying cause and effect is again constant conjunction. Kant is saying his critical philosophy will give us how it is possible to know that every event has a cause, and so that's what his philosophy is giving us. So again, if you really want, and I'm emphasizing this, if you really want to understand Kant, 680 to 681, he's giving you as clearly as Kant can, and Kant is not writing clearly very often. An explanation of what his critical philosophy is giving his readers. So anyways, I want to then move on. Kant's going to make a distinction here between judgments of experience and judgments of perception. This is not a distinction that came up in his first critique, but Kant adds this distinction here because, in some ways, this is one of the clearest things that Kant does, and it really gives you, it shows you how the judgments of perception are what the empiricists gave us. Judgments of perception are what Kant says they are only subjectively valid. And this is what I was just talking about at the beginning of this lecture. How do we get beyond the veil of perception to statements about an objective state of affairs? So the judgments of a perception are simply reporting of what my perception is like, but I have no way to know whether the reporting of what my perception is like is what your perception is going to be like. So on page 681 here, Kant says, empirical judgments, insofar as they have objective validity, are judgments of experience, but those that are subjectively valid I call mere judgments of perception. The latter require no pure concept of the understanding, but only the logical connection of perceptions in a thinking subject. Right? So what's added in the judgment of experience is going to be what Kant calls a pure concept of the understanding. Right? So again, Kant says all our judgments are initially mere judgments of perception. They are valid only for us, for our subject, and only later do we give them a new reference to an object, a desire that they shall always be valid for us and in the same way for everybody else. For if a judgment agrees with an object, all judgments concerning the same object must likewise agree among themselves, and thus the objective validity of the judgment of experience signifies nothing other than its necessary universality. So there you go. That's as clear as you can get, the distinction. The judgment of experience gives us a way to know that what I am saying is not only true for me, but true for anyone else who experiences the world the way I do. And insofar as human beings have a mental apparatus that has space and time as the conditions under which we intuit objects, and as concepts of the understanding that are applied to it, insofar as all human beings share that mental apparatus, we experience the world the same. So that's what Kant is giving us, right? So let me then go to looking at page 682. So Kant is going to say more here about this distinction between a judgment of experience and a judgment of perception. And the question is, how do we get from one to the other? How do we get there, right? And here, so I'm going to read here at 20 on page 682. Kant says, consequently, we must analyze experience in general in order to see what is contained in the product of the senses and the understanding and how the judgment of experience itself is possible. So Kant is saying here, look, all human beings have these two separate faculties, right? This is a distinction that different the philosophers we've read to this point have made, but Kant really kind of draws the line between them. We have the conceptual and we have the intuitive. Right? The intuitive is how experience gets started. We are affected by something in the world. That's how experience gets started up. So that's the sense in which he agrees with the empiricists. But yet you have the understanding, which applies concepts to our experience. So in some sense, you can see Kant, he's got the best of both worlds here. He's got the rationalists with the understanding doing a lot of work, but he's also saying, look, the understanding does no work on its own. The understanding only works insofar as the human subject is affected by something in the world, right? And so we've got both. So the rationalists were right. There is a lot of work that the understanding can do in figuring out the world, but the understanding can't do much on its own. The understanding needs intuitions to work with. So Kant's structure of human cognition in terms of the understanding and the sensibility is crucial, right? Kant famously said in the Critique of Pure Reason that, and I'm going to screw this up here, all intuitions without concepts are empty, and all concepts without intuitions are blind, right? So that distinction, the conceptual and the intuitive, bringing it all together in order to form a cohesive human experience is what Kant's philosophy does. It brings everything together that we've done to this point, right? So then he talks about, so first of all, so I'm reading here from 20 on page 682. The judgment, how is the judgment of experience possible? An intuition of which I become conscious, which pertains merely to the senses, is the first presupposition, right? So we need the intuition. Second, acts of judging are required. So we've got the intuition and we've got the judgment. The intuition is the sensibility, the faculty of sensibility by which I receive objects, and it becomes subject to space and time. And then we've got the judgment, which judges the intuition, right? Second, acts of judging are also required, but this judging may be twofold, right? So we have the intuitions. They come in, the judgments come in, or the intuitions We're affected by something in the world. We have what Kant calls a manifold of intuition, a bunch of intuitions that are unrelated to each other, but then they become subject to space and time as they're received into our, into our sensibility. They become subject to space and time. So once the manifold of intuitions is organized spatiotemporally, then I can judge the manifold of intuition. And I can judge in one of two ways. I can judge it as simply having subjective validity, which is the judgment of perception, or I can add to it the concept of the understanding. And once I add the concept of the understanding, what Kant calls the pure concept of the understanding, once I add it, then it becomes a judgment of experience. So down at the bottom here, when Kant says, hence it is not, as is commonly imagined. So there he's talking about empiricism. Locke, Hume, Berkeley, right? But particular Locke and Hume, who talked about, they're big on associations of ideas and things of that sort. When he's talking about hence it is not, and he's as it is commonly imagined, enough for experience to compare perceptions and to connect them in consciousness through judgments. By these means, no universality and necessity arises, on account of which alone it can be objectively valid and experienced. So that's crucial. Those lines are so crucial because he's saying here that's where empiricism left us. That's where Hume and Locke left us, with the comparison of our perceptions and the perception and the association of them. That's as far as we get, right? But yet, quite another judgment is required before a perception can become experience. I'm reading from 682 here. The given intuition must be subsumed under a concept which determines the form of judging in general with respect to the intuition, connects it in empirical consciousness, in consciousness in general, and thereby establishes validity for empirical judgments. So the form of judging in general. So here's how we're going to get from the judgment of perception to the judgment of experience. Kant is going to say that in the judgment of perceptions, there is a clue that is revealing something of necessity, right? There's a clue. So the example that Kant gives on page 682, if you look at footnote 9, let's look at that together, right? So to take an example that is easier to comprehend. So he's giving us here, how do we get from the judgment of perception to the judgment of experience? This example is supposed to show that. When the sun shines on a stone, it grows warm. This judgment, however often and I and others may have perceived it, is a mere judgment of perception and contains no necessity. Perceptions are only conjoined in this manner. So that's empiricism. Perceptions are only usually conjoined in this manner. So there's no necessity there. But if I say the sun warms a stone, so I'm moving. So when the sun shines on a stone, it grows warm. So there's a kind of necessity there. But then when I say the sun warms a stone, I add the perception. I add to the perception a concept of the understanding, namely that of cause, which connects the concept of heat with that of sunshine as a necessary consequence, and the synthetic judgment necessarily becomes universally valid and consequently objective. It is converted from a perception into experience. So I will tell you this, that is a rare thing for Kant. Kant does not give examples. Kant is never that clear in his philosophy. But this example, if you read it closely, I think it can give you what's going on. So Kant is saying, what is he up to with this table of judgments? And Kant is trying to say that all human beings have, as a necessary condition for the possibility of the experience they have what he calls pure concepts of the understanding. And he says the way that we figure out what these pure concepts of the understanding are by looking at a basic table of judgments. And he's getting these from Aristotle. This goes all the way back to Aristotle. If you look at Aristotle's categories, going all the way back to that work, if you took ancient philosophy, or if you just look, Aristotle, this largely resembles Aristotle's table of categories, right? And Kant is saying that if we can figure out all of the different categories into which our judgments fall, there will be something that's presupposed in those that makes them necessary, right? And what is being presupposed, so to take the example of, so if I have the judgment of perception, which is the sun, when the sun shines on a stone, it grows warm. If we look at on page 683 at the table of judgments and the table of concepts, right? So if we look at the logical table of judgments, the relation that's being described there is a hypothetical one, right? A hypothetical that when the sun shines on the stone, it grows warm. That is the relation that I'm discovering there between them, is that I find these things constantly going together. In my experience of the world, privately, I can report that when I touch the warm stone, I look up and see the sun, and I assume that there is a connection between the two, but there's nothing necessary. But then when Kant says I add a concept to it, I'm adding the concept of causation to my judgment of perception, and that is what gives the hypothetical necessity now gives it necessary causation, right? So I'm adding something to it. So when I add that, that is the sense in which experience is now objective. And it's no longer merely the reporting of my perception. It's that all human beings have these categories of the understanding. Understanding it has a categorical structure. And all human beings have this understanding. And it's the categorical structure that all of us have that make the experience that we do have possible. And under it alone is the experience we have possible. So again, this is part of the critical philosophy, the a priori investigation into the conditions of the possibility of experience. So those conditions are space and time that belong to sensibility, and the categories that belong to the understanding. So again, you kind of see how Kant is giving us the rationalists and the empiricists here. The categories are necessary to make experience possible, to make experience objective by adding objective categories that we all share. But yet at the same time, experience is only possible in the first place if the intuitions are there to get to, there has to be something for the concepts to be applied to. So again, if you think about this from the perspective of somebody like Hume would look at the concept of causation and say there's nothing a priori that we can analyze from that's going to give us anything necessary. And Kant is saying, but wait a second. And this goes then into, if you'd go all the way over to the bottom of page 687, I want to look here quickly. This is a key statement of how Kant is solving Hume's problem here. He says, in order to experiment with Hume's problematical concept, namely the concept of cause, we are first given a priori by means of logic the form of a conditioned judgment in general. So that's the table of judgments on page 683, the table of judgments. By experience, the form of conditioned judgment in general. If this, then this. But no necessity. But there is a kind of, we can infer a kind of connection between this. So experience gives us that, right? Namely, we're first given a priori by means of logic the form of a conditioned judgment in general. But it is possible that we may encounter in perception a rule for this relation that states that a certain appearance is constantly followed by another. And this is the case when I can use the hypothetical judgment and, for instance, say, if the sun shines long enough upon a body, it grows warm. Of course, there is yet no necessary connection and no concept of cause. However, I continue and say, if the above proposition, which is merely a subjective connection of perceptions, is to be a judgment of experience, it must be viewed as necessarily and universally valid. But such a proposition would be, through its light, the sun is the cause of the heat. The rule that was empirical above is now considered as a law, and not merely as valid of appearances, but valid of them for the purposes of possible experience, which requires universal and therefore necessary rules. Therefore, I certainly do not have insight into the concept of cause. I certainly do have insight into the concept of cause as belonging to the mere form of experience and its possibility as a synthetic unification of perceptions and consciousness in general. So to the form of experience in general. And that is the a priori nature of it. Not as to a particular experience, but as to experience, what must experience be like in general, such that it makes sense for us. And a priori, experience must be structured according to the universal concept of causation. That is how our experience makes sense for us. That's how it's intelligible for us. So again, if you want to look at the bottom of page 688, he's going to go on to talk about this is a complete solution of Hume's problem. So I went through this kind of quick, but really you need to understand how do we get from the judgment of perception to the judgment of experience. And if you can understand how we get to the judgment of perception to the judgment of experience, you really do see how Kant's philosophy is giving us what he sees as the solution to how it is that we can have an objective shared experience with each other. And in particular, if you take a look at the notes for today, towards the bottom of the notes for today that I've uploaded to Canvas titled Kant Notes 420, if you take a look at those, Kant at the bottom there, it says, there's something highlighted there at the bottom, but if you look there, we only enter into this common world, we only escape Hume's solipsism through the addition of the categories, which he denied, since he could not find an impression corresponding to them, right? So that was Hume's position. Kant's position is that it is precisely because we cannot get them from experience that they are a priori. They are interpretive stances we must assume if we are going to talk about a public common experience, right? So Kant's philosophy at the end of the day is saying, here's the experience we do have, what conditions make it possible? And the conditions that make it possible are that objects must be intuited spatiotemporally, and we must apply specific, particular categories, pure categories of the understanding to experience in order for our experience to be made intelligible, right? So that is Kant's critical philosophy. I really do hope in reading Kant for today, and I really do sincerely hope you've taken the time to read it and listen to this, because if you've kind of been following the trajectory of this course, Kant's philosophy is supposed to give us the kind of culmination of everything that we've done to this point, and Kant's critical philosophy really does do that. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all soon. Please be looking for some announcements on Canvas regarding a few other things this week. Thank you, and I will talk to you soon.